Okay, hello. It's this is my second live YouTube based around my phobia work, what I do with clients face to face, but also via Skype sessions and through downloads and that kind of stuff. Put it into perspective, and I don't know whether or not this will show on the timing of YouTube. Right now, the time is 27 minutes past midnight. I'm feeling really motivated now to do one of the key processes that I find very successful working with clients to get rid of phobias in a single session. Now, this has many names. Some people will call it a pattern interrupt. Some people will call it a reframe. Some people will call it the Swish pattern. I tend to use multiple approaches to break the pattern. And I'm going to start with a metaphor here. And when I'm working with clients one-on-one, I literally talk about two key metaphors to symbolize what's actually happening neurologically when it comes to phobias. So the first is most people have had the experience of either seeing in real life or seeing on a video a sequence of dominoes. And with those sequence of dominoes, they know or they've seen that if they top the first domino, it then hits the second, hits the third, hits the fourth, hits the fifth. And then it creates, I think there was a game in the 1980s called Domino Rally where you would set up a chain reaction of these dominoes and it would go click, 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 and then kind of follow a sequence. Now there are some really cool, elaborate domino tracks on some of these videos that you can see on YouTube and Facebook, and they literally go on very kind of elaborate journeys. The reason why this is a useful metaphor is because people get that in order for it to follow the sequence, the first domino has to be triggered, and then that creates a chain reaction across all the dominoes until it finally gets the destination. Now, once my clients buy into the premise of a chain reaction, which is what's happening neurologically, by the way, a thought will trigger another thought, will trigger another thought, and it will follow a particular sequence. So I'll explain this and then link it to another couple of metaphors just to make sure it connects with how you're perceiving things as well. So the reason why that's so important with the chain reaction is that if we took a couple of dominoes out in the middle of that sequence, the first few dominoes might click, click, click and fall over, but then the gap would be big enough so that it would never then connect with the following dominoes, and then the pattern is broken. Really important thing. Also with dominoes, suddenly on some of these videos that you see, you can actually have them going off in a different direction. So you can almost like reroute them. Again, a really important metaphor, because what I explain to my clients is that the sequence of a phobia starts off with quite often a trigger, a stimulus as it's known, and then that starts the chain reaction. And the destination of that quite often is panic attacks or severe anxiety. Now the destination is not desirable. It's not desirable at all. But the sequence, the starting process, doesn't have to end up at that particular destination. And the reason why it doesn't have to end up in that destination is because in many cases, other people will see the same stimulus that the phobic is seeing and not ever get to that destination of anxiety or panic. They just won't get there. So therefore, it's not a binary response. It's not that everyone sees that stimulus and then experiences that emotional reaction. It's dependent on the individual, and therefore, the key belief that I want my client to accept as going through this process is an acceptance that the fear is not because of the stimulus. If someone has a fear of dogs or a fear of spiders, they've created a belief system that it's the dogs or the spiders that's causing their fear. And of course it isn't. It's not that at all. The thing that is actually causing the fear is the thought process connected with that stimulus. So once they understand that, and they understand that actually just because the sequence starts doesn't mean it has to finish at the particular destination and actually we can reroute it to a different place, then I ask them the question, as I will ask you the question right now. What emotion would you like to feel as a result of what's currently causing your anxiety? And just think about that for a few moments. At the moment, you see the thing or you think about the thing and you experience anxiety, potentially panic, potentially distress, whatever it might be. That's what's currently happening. But it doesn't have to happen that way, because for many other people, they see the same thing or do the same thing and experience different emotions. So if we got to choose an alternative emotion, what would that emotion be? And, to manage my clients' expectations, I say that, if someone's scared of spiders, the emotion that they end with doesn't have to be love or appreciation or fascination for spiders. Sometimes ambivalence, simply not caring, can be almost like paradise if you've spent virtually your whole life feeling distress and anxiety and panic around this stimulus. So metaphor number one is that there is a sequence of dominoes, okay? And they buy into the premise that actually if either the dominoes were rerouted to a different destination or we took a couple of dominoes out, it would never get to its destination when they fall in that kind of chain reaction. So that's metaphor number one. Metaphor number two is the human ability to chunk things down. Okay, and that's really important because as humans, the moment that we can do things automatically without thinking, we quite often will chunk things down to literally one or two or three things. So quite often a question I will ask my clients is, how did you get to work yesterday or today? How did you get to my clinic? And the answer quite often is, oh, I drove. As you would expect, a lot of people drive to destinations. And then I challenge them on that. I say, well, are you sure that's what you did? You just drove? And they look at me a bit strange and they say, yeah, I just drove. I drove here. And what they're doing is they're chunking down the whole sequence to one thing. So then I will mirror that back and I'll say to them, well, in order to drive, what did you have to do? And they'll say, well, I got in my car and I drove. And then they might chunk it down to 2 steps. And then what I say is, well, look, realistically, you may have started off with having to think of a destination that you wanted to get to, even if you've been on that destination before. You had to wear the right clothes appropriate to driving, because you can't just drive a car, naked or in your underwear or, in your sleeping wear. So you had to get dressed appropriately for that journey. You had to find your keys. You had to leave your house or your flat and walk towards the car. You had to unlock the car. You had to get inside the car. You had to turn the ignition on, put it into gear, take the brake off, and then go through this sequence. Now, the interesting thing is when they were learning to drive, each of these were different components. But once they had driven for a period of time, simply driving becomes one chunk. Okay? And that's important because for many people, they've chunked down the whole experience of a phobia into one chunk. And they just say, dogs freak me out, public speaking terrifies me, whatever it might be. And they've chunked it down to one thing, which isn't helpful. It's not helpful because actually there are lots of different sequences, lots of different dominoes in that process. And then I will challenge my client. I will say to them, well, look, there are a number of things that meant that you couldn't have got to your destination when you were driving your car. If, for example, you'd lost your keys, you couldn't have got there on the car. If you had a flat tire, if you'd run out of petrol, if someone had opened your bonnet and took out the spark plugs, like if any one of these things had happened, that would have prevented you reaching your destination. Now, currently, with your phobia, your destination is distress or anxiety. But if we take out just one of those vital components, if we take out just one domino, then it will prevent you from ever getting to that destination. And then you start seeing them thinking, and then they realize that that's true. that actually we don't have to change everything. If just one thing isn't quite there, then they can't quite get to their destination. Now, for me, again, I'll communicate this to the client each time I work with them. But it's a case of we want to remove the earliest possible domino in the sequence and then reroute it to a different destination. Okay? But it can't be the stimulus itself. That can't be the immediate thing that we reroute. It can't be, because people are surrounded by these stimulus all the time. You know, that's the nature of living. We don't want the solution to not having anxiety to be that you hide yourself away and then never experience the world. You know, that's not a solution. It might be a coping mechanism, which is one of the ways which people become agoraphobic and just kind of stay in their homes and never leave, because avoidance is the number one way that people will use to cope with phobias and severe anxiety. I was in that situation myself. So the goal is not to avoid the stimulus, but to have the stimulus create a different neurological pathway. That's the ideal goal. So these dominoes, these sequence, quite often will start with either seeing the thing or thinking about the thing, and that becomes the sequence. But there tends to be lots of other things that take place. For example, I had a phobia client that had a severe fear of spiders. So much so that she hadn't gone into her garden for, she said, over 2 years. And I said, why couldn't you go into your garden? And she said, well, that's where the spiders are. Now, I regularly host spider workshops. So I'm working with clients, quite often, many people in the room, all with a severe phobia. And sometimes I will need to take spiders to the workshop so they can prove that their fear is gone. And at certain times of the year, it's virtually impossible to find a spider. They're just really hard to find. At certain times of the year, there's lots of them. They're easy to find. But at other times, they're virtually impossible to find. So I know that it's impossible for a garden to be permanently full of spiders. But I was curious about her experience. Because when people can't physically do something, I know that they're making certain thoughts in a particular sequence in their minds to feel a certain emotion, and it's the feeling that makes them feel so unresourceful that they can't do that thing. Okay, so I said, what stops you going into the garden? And she said, well, that's where the spiders are. And I said, really? How do you know? And then I could see her kind of thinking, making a picture in her mind. And I said, when you just made that picture, okay, what were you seeing? And she's saying, well, I was seeing my garden filled with spiders. And I said, was that through your own eyes, or was that looking at your garden as if you're looking at it through someone else's eyes? And she thought a bit, and she's like, well, through my own eyes. And I said, and there were lots of spiders, weren't there? And they were moving. And she was like, well, yes. And I said, were they close up or were they far away? And she said, well, they were close up. Now, the reality is she was making a horror movie inside her own mind, because spiders, typically in the UK, spiders, particularly those that are in the garden, are small, about this big. But for her, not only did she have a garden full of moving spiders, but she'd zoomed up close to them. So, if that was proportionate, these spiders would be like the size of dogs. Now, if you woke up one day and in your garden there was hundreds of dog-sized spiders in your garden, you wouldn't go in your garden either. Okay, but there's this interesting thing that happens, that as humans, we accept that our thoughts are true, and they aren't in many cases. The key question is not to say, is my thoughts true or not, but is it useful or not? And it's not useful to imagine a garden filled with giant-sized spiders that are moving, particularly towards someone. Okay, so I knew that that's what it was in her sequence, that she would make internal representations of spiders, for example. And therefore, the fear wasn't with the spiders. The fear was her association, interpretation, and feelings connected with the images that she was making of these spiders. Crucial pattern. Okay, so the goal of the pattern interrupt really is to look at this sequence and say, right, what are people doing? And then how do we change this sequence to something more useful? So what we're going to cover in this video, the first bit is me explaining the sequence as I do with clients. And then the second bit is me actually doing a guided thought process where you will actually be able to take your experience of whatever it might be, and you might not have a phobia, you just might have something that makes you feel anxious. The structure and the system of interrupting that pattern works regardless. And I have this interesting presupposition, which I'll get to shortly, where the client will attempt and then fail to feel anxiety when they've spent their whole life feeling anxious without thinking about it. And then that surprises them when they can't do that. But the final metaphor that I give clients, and sometimes I'll use just one of these, maybe just the dominoes or just the driving a car analogy, or sometimes two or three of them. The final metaphor is that of rivers and streams. Okay, because neurons and neural pathways can either become very, very fast and automatic, or they can become very, let's say, inconsistent. Depends on the neural pathways. So, for example, if I give a skill as an example, skills are one of those things that when you have mastered a particular skill, you can do it without thinking. So, if you've seen a basketball player or a football player, they're not consciously thinking, "Oh, I need to do this, I need to do that." It's the neurology is hardwired into them. So a basketball player can be virtually anywhere in the court and then know exactly what to do to get the ball in the basket. If they are an elite basketball player, they can do that. And that's because the neural pathways have been rehearsed through repetition and emotional reinforcement so much that that's the equivalent of a giant river. Okay, the neurons just flow through that neural pathway. Okay, whereas if you've tried something, a skill perhaps for the very first time, then you have this thing known as conscious incompetence. The first time you actually attempt to do something, you realize that you're not very good at it, and that's because those neurons haven't connected, they haven't formed a pathway yet. So if you try and juggle for the first time, it's quite challenging to do that. If, however, you're a professional juggler, you can do it while you're daydreaming. You can just juggle and you know how to do it because the neural pathways have been built up. So this is quite a good analogy, because if you imagine a stream, for example, the first time that a well bursts through and it's trying to find its way, it's not going to have a pathway yet. It doesn't have the route. So therefore, it could go in lots of different directions. It's not very efficient. Okay, but if that stream persists, it's going to make a groove in the ground, and then that's going to become the pathway. Okay, and over time, that pathway will get bigger and bigger until it turns into rivers. Now, the key thing is, sometimes rivers can be diverted. Some people have seen or maybe remember geography lessons from their childhood of things like an oxbow lake, where a river used to go in a particular direction, but over time, a new pathway became the route of the river, and then you're left with this remnants of an old system. So this metaphor of rivers and streams or motorways is that I say, well, look, if we put a dam on the main river and then rerouted the river to a different pathway, over time, the original river is going to atrophy, it's going to dry up, and then the new river replaces the old river. And sometimes I'll ask a client about, to relate it to them, a skill. Now, a lot of people work in offices, so sometimes I'll ask them the question. I'll say, look, do you know how to touch type? Now, for a lot of people who work in offices, work on computers all the time, they know how to touch type. So they'll relate to that and they'll say, yeah, I know how to touch type. And then I'll say to them, well, you didn't always know how to touch type, did you? And then they think back and they remember, Actually, for most people, and some people still do that kind of henpecking approach where they kind of use just one or two fingers and kind of do this. And it's a very slow, inefficient way of doing it. But they remember that they used to do it in that slow way. So I remind them. I say, well, look, the neural pathways of being able to type with just a couple of fingers still exists. It's not the dominant, it's not the natural, it's not the automatic way that you would type. But you can still do that if you choose to. But once you find a better way, a better pathway, a better river to that destination, then that becomes your automatic way. So therefore, once we interrupt and change your thought pattern, then why would you ever go back to the less efficient way of doing it? If you have the choice of seeing a spider and feeling fascinated or courageous and you can move it out of your environment, or you can feel anxiety, then your brain naturally is going to drift to the less distressing emotion once it knows how to. And that's what makes what I do with clients actually be self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating, because why would, if someone burns their hand on a fire or on a hot stove, for example, they learn very quickly to avoid pain. Okay. Now, for a lot of phobics, the way they've been trying to avoid pain is by avoiding the stimulus. But that just reaffirms the belief system that it's the stimulus causing the fear rather than the thought process around it. Once the client realizes it's not about the thing itself, but the thoughts connected with the thing, and that they have control over the thought process, then they have the ability to make different choices. Initially, those choices will be conscious. But in the same way that when someone learns to drive or learns to touch type, it was jolty, deliberate, conscious behavior to begin with, which very quickly turns into automatic, unconscious behavior that becomes chunked down to just, oh, well, I just do that. That's how it can look miraculous as to how people can get through phobias so quickly. Because once you give an alternative pathway, once you route those dominoes to a different direction or have an alternative river, an alternative pathway, then why would they go through the distressing pathway if there is a better route, a better option? Now, this may sound quite overwhelming. I'm having different layers and different levels of metaphors here, but the end result is the same. When I'm working with a client, I'm constantly looking at their nonverbal cues to check that they've understood that what they are experiencing isn't a disease. It's not an irrefutable, unsolvable problem. I want them to buy into the belief system, which is true in my mind, that the phobia is not to do with the thing itself, but to do with the sequence of thoughts that follows that. Once they've accepted that, then my job is to ask them a sequence of questions to figure out what that sequence is for the individual. Now, the structure of a phobia is very, very similar. It's very similar for most people. That's why we can label it as a phobia, because it's a similar reaction. That's how it can be diagnosed or labeled in that particular way, because it's similar for lots of different people. But the unique experience of the individual can be different. For example, even when you're not around these things. So let's just use snakes as an example. I've worked with several clients that have phobias of snakes, and I'll say to them, look, you have this kind of fear of snakes. Snakes aren't a common thing. We don't see snakes every single day. And I'm willing to bet that you experience anxiety around snakes much more frequently than you see snakes. At which point I can see them thinking, and they accept, well, that's true. And I say, well, look, if it's not about the snakes themselves, it must be thoughts about those snakes. And I'm willing to bet that those thoughts about snakes are either things that have happened, so memories, or things that could happen in the future. Okay? Because if they're not experiencing the snake itself in the present, then it has to be either the past or the future, at which point they accept that that's true. And I say, well, look, let's just start with things that have happened in the past. Can you think of a distressing experience that you had around snakes, for example? And of course they can. Because if someone is a phobic, then they have had genuine experiences being around the thing, because that is a stimulus that have caused their sequence of dominoes to get them to a distressing part. That's also, by the way, as to how they have evidence that they can label themselves of having that particular phobia. So the key thing is, I then ask them, I say, well, look, if you were to think about that memory right now, would it be distressing? Would it cause anxiety? And of course they say yes. And I say, look, I don't want you to choose your most intense, the most distressing memory, but give me one that's kind of like 2 or 3 or 4 down the list. A memory that was distressing, but not the most distressing. And normally they can think of one, and I ask them to describe it. And what I'm looking for here is their nonverbal cues that tell me that they're making a picture or a movie inside their mind, which for most people, that's how they experience memories. Okay? But before I do that, I'll ask them a question. And that question that I'm going to ask them is, when you were 10 years old, were you still living in the house that you're living in now? Now, for most people, when they were 10 years old, they live in a different place. Because then as a child, they might have been living with parents, and now as an adult, they have their own place. Okay? So they will say, well, yes, I lived in a different place. And I say, when was the last time you even saw that place? And for some people, it might be 10, 20, 30 years. For other people, their parents might still be living in the house. But either way, they're not that familiar with the layout of that. So then I ask them a question. I will say, I want you to tell me how many rooms are in that house when you were 10 years old. Now, people don't intuitively just know how many rooms are in a house. Sometimes I'll ask how many windows or how many doors are in that house. And what they do is they defocus their eyes. Sometimes they'll have to kind of, close their eyes. Because sometimes, by the way, the first reaction is to guess. And I can tell a guess between actual thought out process of them going through the actual being in the moment. So I say, about 8, about 7. And I say, if your life depended on it, how many rooms, how many doors, how many windows were in the house that when you were 10 years old? And then they take, and it takes less time than they think. They think it's going to be a really big thought. It's not. So within about 5 or 6 seconds, they've told me, let's say that there is 10 doors or 8 rooms in that house. And then I'll say to them, look, you weren't in this room at that point. You were back in the house of when you were 10 years old, and you were wandering through your house, counting how many doors, how many windows were in your house. Is that right? And they look at me a bit surprised, like I'm a mind reader. But of course, people don't intuitively know how many doors, how many windows, how many rooms were in the house when they were 10 years old. They have to go back to that moment and re-experiencing it. And they re-experience it as if they're experiencing it through their own eyes, which is a really important element of the process. So again, I'm kind of priming that I know what's happening inside their mind. And I also want them to accept that they can make pictures in their mind. Because quite often people will say, I can't visualize. I know that for the vast majority of phobics, they're very good at making pictures in their mind because that's what freaks them out the vast majority of the time. It's not the real thing, it's the thoughts about the real thing. So I want them to accept 2 things. One, that they can make pictures in their head. And secondly, that the pictures in their head can create emotional feelings. Okay? And then I'll take them back to that time where it might be the 3rd or 4th most distressing experience that they've had with their phobia. And I'll say, I want you to go back to that time. And I'm constantly interrupting their experience. And I can see the moment they're into it, I'll say, stop right there. By the way, were you seeing yourself as someone else, or were you looking at things through your own eyes? Now, the interesting thing with phobics is in the vast majority of cases, they see themselves, or they don't even see themselves. They're looking at the experience of perhaps when they were 5 or 6 or 7 years old, whenever it was, through their own eyes, as if they're back there in the moment. Okay, that's a crucial thing, because I know that when people are associated into the memory, there is a higher link between the thought and the emotional feeling, okay, which is an important part of the process. So what I then do is I say, look, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your phobia. Okay, and I'm actually going to do this with you right now, because part of what I do with these live videos is and this is why there's a broadcast quality microphone here, and this is being filmed to the camera, and I have an extra microphone there taking it to a mixing desk. The reason why I do all this kind of stuff is that I need to do these recordings anyway, because on my website, phobiaguru.com, there are different digital downloads and audio files and lots of different ways, mainly because most people can't afford, without sounding arrogant, most people can't afford to work with me, or they're not in the right proximity. You know, I've worked with people in Canada and Dubai and all different parts of the world, and it's not easy for them to simply see me in my clinic in Harley Street. So I need to do this stuff anyway, but for me, I'm obsessed with creating value. You know, part of why I do what I do is because in my late teens and early 20s, I had a number of very severe phobias and anxiety disorders, like social anxiety disorder. There was a period of my life where I couldn't even leave a tiny studio apartment without my heart, you know, beating out of my chest. So for me, I've been there. I've had that experience. And back then, YouTube didn't exist. It was very difficult for me to find the information I needed to get me through my fears and my phobias. So I want to make it a lot easier for other people to not have the same hurdles and challenges. I had to spend months reading about all different anxieties and fears and phobias. It would have been a relief to me if I could just watch videos and learn about this stuff, so I didn't have to go on such a lengthy journey. But they say there's a reason for everything. So right now, what I'm about to do is actually record this stuff so that my clients that work with me through my 7-day phobia system will be able to get the edited, polished version of the recording I'm about to do right now. But you know, here you are on YouTube, you're getting this content for free. It's not the polished final version that my clients will get. And all I would say is, if this stuff has been useful in any way, I'm not expecting a donation. I'm not expecting that you should go to my website and buy my services. But what would be helpful, because I want to get this out to as many people as possible, YouTube have certain algorithms and they reward engagement. So if you like anything here, it'd be really appreciated from me, but also it might be helpful to someone else if you can give it a comment or a share or a like or something like that, because anything where you engage with it basically means YouTube thinks, oh, this is useful stuff, therefore other people might want this stuff. So if you could do that, that'd be very much appreciated. Just click the like button or subscribe, anything like that, really, really appreciated. Okay, so I'm going to have a little bit of a pause just so that when my editor downloads this file, he knows kind of when to start kind of snipping certain bits. And then I'm actually going to take you through the process of asking a series of questions so that we can interrupt your anxiety experience. Okay. So I want you to think of a memory of when you've actually experienced something that caused your phobia. And I want you to go back to that time right now. I want you to re-experiencing it. And I want you to get a feeling of where the location of where that anxiety is. For many people, anxiety is located somewhere around the gut or the stomach or the solar plexus. It's kind of around this area here, but check where it is for you. Okay? And one of the things I want you to do is to give that level of anxiety a score from 1 to 10. 10 being the highest levels of anxiety and 1 or 0 being very low levels of anxiety. 0 obviously being no anxiety whatsoever. But if it was a genuinely distressing memory of yours where you've experienced that phobia, then for me, I tend to categorize numbers. So if it's under 4, for example, that's discomfort. That's what I label discomfort. It's not desirable, but it's manageable, it's tolerable. Okay? Between 4 and about 8, I will label that anxiety. Severe anxiety is going to be, the 7 or the 8. Okay? And 5 or 6 is going to be milder levels of anxiety. And things that are over 8, I will label that panic. Okay? Panic is really the point where the sympathetic nervous system kicks in. It's the equivalent of red alert inside your mind, where it's saying, I don't think you can cope with this, and therefore my solution is to flood your body with all these neurotransmitters that may be of some help, but we don't know. But what do we have to lose? Okay. And those things that your body does would have been really, really useful thousands of years ago to your ancestors if they were being stalked by a saber-toothed tiger. When there is a perceived threat or risk at that level, that fight or flight or freeze, fight or flight kind of reaction, that sympathetic nervous system would be really, really useful. Okay. But I want you to think about your experience right now. Get a sense of where you feel the anxiety, and I want you to give it a grade between 1 and 10 as to how severe that is. Now, if it's not your most severe experience, then it might be something between, let's say, a 6 or 7 or 8 level experience of anxiety. Okay? And I want you to think about what you're seeing in your mind's eye to experience that 6, 7, 8 anxiety. And if it's useful, you can close your eyes and then open your eyes in between the questions that I'm asking you. So you're back there, seeing what you saw at the time, and genuinely feeling anxiety. You can feel where that anxiety is experienced for you, quite often in the gut, and you can give it a number, a score on a level of 1 to 10, called an SUD, a subjective unit of distress. Okay? And let's say it's 7, because I'm not there with you. I wouldn't be able to calibrate or know what you're experiencing right now. But let's just say it's a level 7. In order for you to feel that level 7 anxiety, you're probably making a picture of the thing itself. And in most cases, when I work with clients, if that thing is further away, or there's more ability to move away from the situation, or if the perceived risks are lower, then it tends to be a lower score, let's say a 4 or 5 perhaps. And if it's a feeling of being overwhelmed, that there is very little options and you can't move away from whatever this situation is, it tends to be a higher level. You will know because you're back there in that moment experiencing that particular thing. So that's really, really important. Okay. Key thing here is that I'm going to ask you to do a certain sequence so that we can change how you feel about this particular memory. Okay, and the first thing I want you to do is to imagine putting a frame around this image. Okay, because the key thing is, this is a memory, it's not real. But when we have memories where we're seeing things through our own eyes, the unconscious mind can't differentiate between the memory and reality, because when you're seeing things through your own eyes, it feels like it's happening in the present. Okay, and that's why your unconscious mind is perceiving it to be an imminent, real, current threat. That's why you feel this kind of reaction, and people can have panic attacks from memories. In some cases that would be labeled PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, is quite often what people will report having re-experiences, flashbacks, as if they're back there re-experiencing the very thing like it's happening to them, present tense. Okay? So if you're feeling anxiety based on a memory, you're probably seeing it as if it's happening rather than something that's happened. Okay? Crucial distinction. So to label this in your mind, I want you to put a frame around it. Now, for most people, they're not really conscious of the kind of size of memories. For most people, if it's through their own eyes, it's going to feel like it's life size. Okay, so they're experiencing it through their mind's eye as if it's a life-size experience. Now, through any memory, any thought, like if you're looking at me right now on a screen, then your peripheral vision is all blurry, because the nature of sight is that you focus on certain things and other things are blurry. Okay, makes sense. So the key thing is, it might be life-size, but that doesn't mean everything's in focus, because your brain can't possibly focus on everything at the same time. It's not how your eyes work. So the key thing is, if we put a border around it, then the thing that's in focus is visible, but the border signifies that this is a imagined memory. Okay, it's an event that's happened rather than something that's happening. And that could be a frame, it could be a colorful border, just something to signify that it's not real. And then I want you to think about, has the anxiety level changed? Now, for most people, it doesn't change that much because they're still focused on looking at the thing through their own eyes as if it's still happening. The fact that there's a border around it just kind of makes them think, oh, right, okay, it's an unusual thing. Now, the point of the border is nothing ever other than to be able to manipulate the image, because what I want my clients to be able to do is to know that this image is something that can be manipulated. And by doing something simple like putting a border around, gives them evidence that they can change things. So we change things at a small level before we make the bigger changes. That's a crucial part of the ingredient. Okay. So the key thing now that I want you to do is to think of that image with the border in, and then just shrink it down. Okay. Shrink it down to the size of a 5p piece. Now, if you're not in the UK, a 5p piece might be the same thing as a dime, for example, or a very small coin, like a penny, for example. Okay, a small coin. Now, by shrinking it down, okay, that's really, really important, because as it gets smaller, the details get less clear. Okay. And also what I'm going to ask you to do is, as you're shrinking it down, I want you to drain all the color out. Because for it to feel real, you're probably perceiving it to be in real color through your own eyes. And if we shrink it down and also take the color away, so it's all black and white, then suddenly it becomes less real. And the fact that it's less real means that the anxiety tends to go down. And I want you to try this right now. I want you to think of that memory that caused, let's say, a level 6 or 7 level of anxiety. Think of the memory, imagine you're back there experiencing it, put a border around it, and as you shrink it down, drain all the color out. So you've now got a small black and white image. And as you shrink it down, I don't want you to just shrink it down in front of you. Shrink it down and move it further away. Okay? So by doing that, what you're doing is you're creating distance, you're reducing the size, but also you're draining the color out. Now, the color is an interesting thing, because when you think about movies, okay, movies do an interesting thing. In many cases, if you have a movie set in two different times, so the present and the past, quite often they will have a signifier to represent the past. Now, sometimes they'll even do cheesy things, like they'll have a harp music, and then or the screen kind of goes all wavy, or it's slightly defocused. But in many cases, it's black and white. So black and white represents the past, and color represents the present. Okay? But for the purpose of this, it doesn't matter. We're just changing it from what's real to what's not so real. Okay? So we're shrinking it down, making it further away, draining the color out. Okay? And now we've got something the size of a small coin. Okay? And while you're thinking about the image being that size, that distance, in that shade of color, still with the box around it to signify that it is a memory that's happened rather than something that's happening, notice that feeling of anxiety and notice that it has reduced. That it is impossible to feel high levels of anxiety with the image being like that size, in that distance, in that shade, and with the border around it. And it might have gone from, let's say, a level 7 to a level 4, because you still know what's in the image. It's just that the image is further away. Okay? So you're doing that right now, and it's not the finished thing. Okay? So now what I say to my clients, and what I'm going to say to you, is that if I flicked a coin right now, you would know what a spinning coin looks like. If I was doing heads or tails, you would know what that's like. Okay? And everyone does, because everyone's played heads or tails at least once in order to make an important life choice. Say heads or tails, right? That's what it is. So you get this sense of something spinning very, very fast. Spinning so fast, in fact, that it becomes a blur until it stops. Okay? So that coin-sized image that represents a distressing memory, we're going to mess up that pattern. It's the equivalent of taking some dominoes out of the sequence. Okay? Now, it starts off, of course, with you seeing the thing that's being distressful. Okay, that's triggering the stress. Okay, but we've put a border on it, we shrinked it down, we drained the color out, we've made it further away. And now I want you to imagine that this coin is bright white on one side and then black on the other. So black, white, black, white, black, white. Okay, and all I want you to do is imagine that if I flick that coin, it would go black, white, black, white, black, white so quickly that it would be a grey blur. Now that image that you've shrunk down, I want you to do this again in this particular sequence. And the particular sequence is, I want you to remember that distressing memory, very quickly put a border on it, and as you're shrinking it down, drain all the colour out, make it the size of a coin, and then at that speed, black, white, black, white, black, white, black, white. Okay? Now you just do that just a couple of times. So think of the distressing memory, border on it, shrink it down, and then black, white, black, white, black, white. And here's the challenge. While you're doing that, while it's a small coin-sized image, what I want you to do is to try your hardest to feel anxious while the memory itself is a black and white blur, almost like a grey blur. Now do that now. Now for most people, the fact that we've taken the image and made it black, white means that there is nothing really there. But we're going to add a dimension as well in there, because the whiteness could represent putting the brightness on full, and the darkness could represent draining all the brightness away. If you think of any kind of settings on a video device or on your monitor, you can have the brightness on full, it goes all white. You can have the brightness completely to zero and the whole screen goes dark. In the same way, you can imagine what it's like for volume. Okay, so there might be sounds in your memory as well. And I want you to imagine at the same rate of black, white, black, white, black, white, volume can be so loud it's distorted, and then so quiet it's like mute. So like full volume, mute, full volume, mute, full volume, which would actually make the sound almost like a... It's almost like when you're in a car with your window down, and then you go past like a series of, let's say, kind of trees or things in close proximity. You get this kind of sound. And that's what it will be like when you hear this thing, because the volume's really loud and then nothing, really loud and then nothing, really loud and nothing, at the same rate of a coin spinning up and down heads and tails. Okay, so do that again. Take the distressing memory and this time add the volume element in there as well. So as it shrinks down and then that would be the experience, black, white, but also the sound going full and then mute, full and then mute, full and then mute, so that we can distort. We're interrupting the pattern here. So do that with the added volume element as well. That's great. Now, for most people at this point, and certainly my clients, their anxiety has gone from a level 6 or 7 or 8 right down to like a 1 or a 2. So much so that the harder they try to feel anxious, when the memory is like that, they simply can't. Now, the crucial thing here is that I then have evidence, and they have evidence, that it is not about the thing itself. It's not about the memory, but it is about how they're perceiving that particular memory. And when they're perceiving the memory in a distorted, disassociated, kind of odd way, where they can't make out what's happening and the volume's all distorted, then the whole thing means it's impossible for them to feel anxious. But that's just the first part of the process. And I want you to do this with a couple of different memories. Okay, so choose another more intense memory of, again, where you've had a reaction, a distressing reaction, potentially even panic. And I want you to re-experience that. And the point where you start to feel the anxiety coming, that's the point where you put the border on, shrink it down, drain all the color out, and then, okay? And just do this with at least 2 different memories so that you absolutely know that you can take something that makes you feel anxious and then you can manipulate the thought. You may not be able to manipulate the thing itself, but you can manipulate the thought. So that's it. So just do that now. Think of a different memory. Imagine being there, experiencing it through your own eyes the moment you start to feel the anxiety as a result of the trigger. Border on it, shrink it down, and then try and attempt to feel anxious when you're thinking about it in that specific way. That's right. And you can do that again with a different memory as well. Maybe a different time, maybe a more intense time or a different time of your life. But again, similar experience. You generally had an anxiety reaction, put the border on it, shrink it down, and then... Now that's the first part of the sequence. The second part of the sequence is that I want you to imagine that there is a alternative emotional resource that would be useful. Okay? So, for example, I'm willing to bet that there is a single time in your life that you felt very resourceful at a time when other people were losing their minds. Okay, when other people were freaking out, you felt very calm, you felt resourceful, and you coped in that situation. Or there is something that you enjoy that you know for a fact that other people are scared of. Okay, so I've used this example before, but that was a client that I worked with, and she was very confident when it came to performing in front of other people, particularly doing karaoke and singing, but she had a fear of a particular animal. Okay, so her resource was that she could do something that other people were frightened of, but she felt confident in that particular situation, and that's a crucial element in this process. So once you've thought about that resource, I want you to think about where that resource is located within you. Okay, and it might be that feeling of confidence in a particular posture. For a lot of people, it's either in their head or in their heart, but there's a feeling of, well, when I'm in that place, when I'm doing that thing, or back then, yes, I felt very resourceful. So all we're doing now is we're priming your unconscious mind to know that there is an alternative part within you that can actually be very resourceful in a time that other people would find it distressing or stressful. Okay, so we don't need to do anything other than just accept that you can be resourceful in a stressful situation. Because now what I want you to do is I want you to go back to that memory, shrink it down, make it all blurry, and then black, white, and then from within that image, take an image where you see yourself handling the situation with that resource that you know you have access to, that confident resource where you can do it in a resourceful way. So the whole sequence is that you're, through your own eyes, imagining a particular memory, and then we're putting the border on it, shrinking it down, making it all blurry, and then from within that image, taking a very small image and making that really, really big. But this time, it's not through your own eyes. You're seeing yourself as if you're someone else, coping very well in that exact same situation. You're seeing the resourceful version of you being able to manage very, very well. And this is big and it's bright and it's colorful and it feels really realistic, but you're seeing yourself handle the situation you would have liked to have handled it if you had this feeling of confidence and resourcefulness in that same situation. And I want you to do that now. That same memory, which was a 6 or a 7 fear or anxiety to begin with, go through the whole process. The moment you start to feel anxious, shrink it down, and then an image from within that becoming really, really big. But this time you're seeing yourself as if you're someone else coping well in that situation, whatever coping well means to you. And that's right. And as you see yourself doing this, and this should only take literally about 5 to 10 seconds, but as you see yourself coping in that situation, you might notice that the anxiety is non-existent. Because in order for you to feel anxious, you have to be perceiving it through your own experience. And actually what we're doing right now is we're detouring the dominoes to a different destination. Because if you can see yourself coping, then that will never reach the threshold element where your mind is thinking, I'm overwhelmed, I can't cope, therefore you need this adrenaline, you need this kind of fight or flight, sympathetic nervous system neurotransmitters flooding through your body, just in case that helps. If you perceive yourself coping in that situation, that's not necessary. Because the opposite of feeling overwhelmed and threatened is coping. And you're seeing yourself, the resourceful version of you, cope in that same situation. And I want you to test it out with those 2 other memories that you thought of as well. So you're seeing yourself in the second image coping well because you know that's the version of you that has the resource necessary to cope. That's right. So we've gone through the whole sequence now, and if you need to kind of rewind and kind of play this again and again until you get it right, that's absolutely fine. The important thing is that we are detouring. We're taking the river that's going in one direction, and the equivalent of this kind of shrinking it down and making it all blurry and then black, white, that's the equivalent of a dam on that particular thing. And then what we're doing now with having that small image get big of you coping well in that situation is we're creating this new stream and diverting the river to a different pathway. We're adding new dominoes that take you into a new destination, because if you know that you can cope, which you can, by the way, but once you know that you can cope in that same situation, then suddenly you don't feel levels of anxiety. And this self-fulfilling prophecy that's been taking place, that because you don't feel that you can cope, then your brain and your mind is feeling overwhelmed and distressed and avoidant, and then you feel really anxious, which then proves that you can't cope, and then you have a panic attack perhaps. That's the sequence that we're in at the moment. And the new sequence is that when you realize that actually it's not about the thing itself, but the thoughts around the thing, and I've got the ability to control those thoughts, even if I can't control the actual thing itself, then at least if I can perceive myself coping in that situation, then I'm more likely to actually attempt that in a resourceful way rather than in a non-resourceful way. And by doing it in a resourceful way, you're then going to have evidence that you can indeed cope. And you only have to cope 1 or 2 times for that to become irrefutable evidence that you can cope every time. And then that means that the anxiety goes away. Now, we've done this about the past. We can also do it about the future. Because if we accept that actually the thing itself is not the key cause of a phobic's problem. For example, if you have a fear of flights, the actual flight itself is a small part. Most of the anxiety comes from worrying about booking the flight, worrying about what you're going to do on the plane if something happens. These are either worrying about future things, which is what worry is, thinking about the future, okay, or reflecting on the past and then thinking, oh, I know I can't do that future thing because in the past it happened. Well, if every time you think about the past, it starts off with you experiencing an anxious situation, but then we redivert it into seeing that you could have coped well had you had the resources necessary at that time, well, then suddenly the future doesn't feel so anxious anyway. But the crucial thing is that that same sequence we can do with a future event. So, for example, for most people, they create images of the future where they see themselves in that future, because you can't have a future memory because it hasn't happened yet. So typically people see the future of them in the images and the past through their own eyes. That's typically what tends to happen when it comes to memories and thoughts and that kind of stuff. But we can do it in a different way, because most phobics, when they think of a future event, if you think of, let's say, fear of public speaking, for example, people don't see themselves on the stage. They imagine that being on the stage is happening to them right now, and they see the microphone and they see all these eyes looking at them and they feel terrified. Well, you're imagining a future event if that's taking place, because that future event hasn't happened yet. So again, you can think about that future event, and as you start to see it through your own eyes, shrink it down, make it all blurry, and then have a really big, bright image of you coping well in that situation in the future event. And by doing that consistently, so whenever you think about an image of the past, a memory of the past that was distressing, suddenly we can zap all of that anxiety out, and instead you see yourself coping really, really well. And then in the future event, you can also do the same thing. Okay? And there is one final component that I like to add in, and for any people into NLP, you'll know that this is a very different version of what's known as the Swish pattern. You know, there are additional components in here, rather than just kind of make an image, shrink it into the corner, and all this kind of stuff. But this is based on real life experience of me working with hundreds of phobics, so it's tailored to phobics, and I have to, of course, acknowledge Richard Bandler's role in the process of patterns to deal with phobics, because they work, they're very, very effective. But for me, I've worked with so many phobics, I can fine tune this and kind of find out what works for my experience and what works for the clients. So the key thing is, what I tend to add is a final component to the Swish pattern. So one of the questions that I will ask my clients is, have they ever had the experience of playing a computer game where you can switch perspective? Okay, so for example, in a lot of these computer games, you can play the game if it's kind of like a zombie shooting game or something like Fortnite or even Super Mario Kart, you can quite often have a button on the control pad where you switch the perspective. So you can have the first person perspective, you can have the perspective where you're seeing them from behind, quite often hovering over their head, or from the side. You can change the perspective. So the key thing I want them to do is to be able to switch in and out of first person. So the first person is the actual stimulus. So they're going into it, and I want you to do this now. Think of a time in the future that you would be worried about with your phobia. And then as you're going through that, the moment that you start to feel any kind of anxiety about doing that, we shrink it down, make it all blurry, and then we have a big image of you seeing yourself successfully doing that role. Whatever it is that has been causing anxiety, you see yourself coping really, really well in that particular situation. And then when you've accomplished it and you've seen yourself accomplish, and that could be taking a flight and landing in your destination. That could be picking up a spider and getting out of your room. That could be going to the park and just stroking a dog. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. Just see yourself doing the thing that you have been fearing well. And then after you've accomplished that, then jump into that first person perspective, almost like a switch on a game. So you get the feelings of relief and pride and accomplishment that you've been able to do that well. Okay, really, really important, because if you can go from the bit that causes anxiety, we disassociate, and you see yourself coping really well, which makes that a motivational, compelling blueprint as to what you would like to do, but then associate into the good feelings that you get from having done it, then what we're doing is we're priming you to want to do the very thing in a resourceful way to prove to yourself that you can do this whenever you need to. So this has been the Swish pattern, or the pattern interrupt for phobias. Hope this has been useful. Key thing here is really to re-listen to this and re-watch the video as many times as you need to break those patterns, to take those dominoes out and reroute it into a place which is actually useful for you. And hope this has been useful. If it has been useful, please comment which bit has been particularly useful for you. That's really good feedback loop for me. If there's someone that you think this could be useful for, share it with them. And if you want to get more content like this, completely free, click subscribe, and then you'll be notified whenever I do a live video or whenever I upload some new stuff on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for giving me your attention, your time. Hope this has been useful, and I look forward to speaking with you again.